The last thing the Callaways had asked me before confirming the visit was whether the street was paved. I told them yes, it was, and that the streetlights were being installed that very week. It wasn't exactly a lie. The asphalt was there, the poles were there. I just didn't mention that half of them still had no wiring. I got there at 4:40, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. I do that on every new showing. I need time to understand what I'm selling before I try to sell it. The street was wet from a rain that had stopped in the morning, and the mud from the construction on the sides had run down onto the shoulder in wide, dark streaks that the gray late afternoon light made look uglier than they probably were. I mentally adjusted the entry angle I'd use with the Callaways, come in from the right side, where the facade caught whatever was left of the light in the sky, instead of from the left, which was sitting in shadow. The house was good. I had to admit that. 2 stories, sand-colored synthetic stone facade, large windows, a front yard with no grass yet but with the bed lined and the soil leveled. Inside, light hardwood floors on the ground level, open kitchen, 3 bedrooms upstairs with an ensuite in the master. Everything new, everything carrying that specific smell of recent construction. Paint, wood, floor adhesive, a faint background of drywall dust that never fully disappears in the first few weeks. I walked through the rooms slowly, the way I always do. Not like an inspection, like a reading. Every space has an argument, and my job is to understand it before I present it. The living room had high ceilings and a side window that framed the woods out back, which could be sold as privacy or as nature, depending on the buyer. The bedrooms were well proportioned, without that common problem of hallways eating into usable space. The garage had an electric door, but the motor hadn't been installed yet. It was stacked in boxes in the corner. Outside, I heard the construction trucks pulling out. It was 5:02. The workers kept a strict schedule and never broke it by a single minute. This was my 3rd time coming to this development, and I already knew that at 5 o'clock sharp, a silence fell that the city never produces. Not the silence of a quiet place, the silence of an empty one. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking out the back window at the yard. The woods started about 30 feet past the retaining wall, a dense line of oaks and brush that the rain had made darker, more compact. The sky above it was an almost purple gray, that shade that happens when the light leaves without going through orange first. Beautiful, if you're into that kind of thing. I prefer light. The Callaways arrived at 5:11. They were younger than I expected. He was probably in his early 30s, she was maybe less. Both of them with that look of a couple still figuring out what they want. He was carrying a water bottle and wearing running shoes that were completely wrong for all that mud. She walked a step behind him, looking at the unfinished houses on either side of the street with an expression I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't disappointment. It was assessment. I introduced myself, shook both their hands, made the standard comment about the weather and led them to the entrance. He asked about the square footage right away. She asked how many houses in the development had already sold. I answered both. 2,200 square feet of built area, 3 units sold out of 28 available, with 6 more in negotiations. She nodded but said nothing. The showing went at the normal pace for the first 15 minutes. Living room, kitchen, half bath, garage. He asked technical questions. Insulation, electrical system, water pressure. She hung back a little in each room, running her hand along the walls, looking into the corners like she was searching for something I didn't know the name of. Upstairs, while he measured the master bedroom mentally with his own footsteps, she went to the window that faced the backyard and stood there looking at the woods for long enough that I noticed. "A lot of shade in the afternoon," she said. "It makes up for it in the summer," I said. "The woods hold the heat back and the house stays a good 3 degrees cooler than the ones up front." She didn't answer. She kept looking. It was 5:40 when I went back downstairs to grab the folder with the floor plans and financing info I'd left on the kitchen counter. The ground floor was darker than when we'd come in. The light outside had dropped fast, the way it does in October when the sky is overcast. I picked up the folder, looked out the kitchen window at the backyard out of habit. There was something at the edge of the woods. I went still. It was large, It was standing upright in a posture that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen in that area or anywhere else. Tall, too tall. The distance and the bad light blurred the details, but the mass was real. The silhouette was real, and there was something in the way it was just standing there, not moving, not pulling back, that made something in my stomach clench before I'd even registered that I was afraid. I stood there watching for maybe 4 seconds. Then I heard the Calloway's footsteps on the floor above and went back upstairs. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. I was still trying to find a category to put it in. Large animal, tree shadow, some abandoned structure from the construction. I handed out the folders, walked them through the financing plan, answered 2 more of his questions about the county property tax. At 10 to 6, I tried to wrap up the showing. That's the part people on the outside never think about. Closing has technique. You can't just say it's over. You have to create the right momentum. The feeling that the natural next step is walking out the door with your head full of possibilities and not unanswered questions. I use the line I always use. I'll leave the financing info with you. Any questions that come up over the next few days, just give me a call. It works because it turns leaving into continuation, not closure. He tucked the folder under his arm and asked if I had a card. I grabbed one from my bag and handed it over. She had her back to both of us, looking out the living room window at the street. The evenly spaced poles, the unfinished houses on either side with their facades covered in weatherproofing wrap, the muddy shoulder catching the last of the light. I heard her say quietly, almost to herself, "It got dark fast." It had. In October in Kellard, the sky closes like that. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone flipped a switch. The street was noticeably darker than when the Callaways had arrived, and the unwired poles weren't going to fix that. I picked up my phone to check the time and saw I had no signal. 1 bar where there should have been 3 or 4. I tried refreshing. Nothing. Kellard has bad coverage in general, and this part of the development was at the far edge of the cell tower grid, with the woods absorbing whatever signal made it through. It happened on my first visit too, and it always sorted itself out once I got back to the main road. It wasn't a problem yet. I walked them to the front door, opened it, let them go out first. The air outside was colder than it had been an hour ago, and smelled like wet earth and something vegetal I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but strong, like when rain wakes up the inside of a place that's been shut for a long time. The mud in the front yard had a dry crust on the surface but gave under weight, and Calloway's sneakers sank 1.5 inches when he stepped off the porch. I closed the door behind me. I was about to go around the side to check whether the back window I'd cracked open for ventilation was closed. I'd do that out of habit. When she said her husband's name, once, with a quality in her voice that made me stop before I'd taken a single step. She was looking to the left side of the street. I turned. The werewolf was standing between the 2nd and 3rd unfinished houses, about 40 feet from where we were, standing upright. And this time there was no distance, no bad light to blur anything. The residual glow in the sky was enough, and it was standing still, not hiding, not pulling back, just there. Tall, taller than anything that should have been standing on that street. The fur was dark and dense, thicker at the trunk and shoulders, thinner on the arms that hung with a weight that seemed wrong for an upright posture. The head was wide, the muzzle pushed forward, the ears raised. It was facing our direction. None of the 3 of us said anything for a moment. Then Calloway said, "What is that?" in the voice of someone waiting for somebody to offer a reasonable explanation. I didn't offer one. I didn't have one. What was in front of me wasn't a bear. I know the silhouette of a bear and the posture of a bear, and that wasn't it. It wasn't a deer, wasn't a dog, wasn't any combination of things my brain tried to put together in the first few seconds. It was what it was, and what it was had no name I wanted to use at that moment. It took 1 step toward us. Just one. Slow, heavy, with that stride that pressed into the mud in a way I almost heard from that distance. Then it stopped. "Get inside," I said. I didn't shout. I shouted internally, but what came out was low and direct, the kind of voice I use when I need someone to hear me without panicking. "Inside now. Both of you." She was already backing toward the door. He stood still for 1 second longer than he should have, staring, and I had to put my hand on his arm and give him a slight push before he moved. We got the door open, got inside. I closed it and threw the deadbolt. The living room was almost dark. I went straight to the switch and turned on every light on the ground floor. Living room, hallway, kitchen. The half-bath sconce whose reflection bled into the corridor. Light wasn't going to fix anything, but I needed to see the space I was inside and stop thinking about the space I was outside of. He stood in the middle of the living room. She went to the side window and I said, "Don't stand near the window," before I could soften my tone. She stepped back. "Does anyone have signal?" I asked. He checked. She checked. I already knew the answer but needed to confirm. None of the three of us had anything. "It's a bear," he said. "There are black bears in Pennsylvania, I know there are." I didn't answer. I went to the kitchen window. I kept to the side, not straight in front, and looked at the backyard from the corner of my eye before looking directly. The yard was empty. The woods were there, dark, the line of oaks barely visible against the overcast sky. I went back to the living room. "How long does it take to walk to the entrance of the development?" she asked. Controlled voice. More controlled than her husband's, I noticed. "About 12 minutes by the main road," I said. "If the road is clear." She understood what I hadn't said. I saw it in the way she looked at me. No surprise, just that weight of someone who had already been suspecting something before I confirmed it. Outside, somewhere between the house and the street, I heard the sound of something stepping through the mud. Heavy, even, moving toward the side of the house. None of the three of us moved. I listened to the footsteps until they stopped. There was no way to tell where. The mud muffled the sound in a way that made it hard to track the position. It seemed like it was on the right side. Then it seemed like it had turned toward the back. Then nothing. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your head try to fill it with things that aren't there. Calloway stood in the middle of the living room for longer than he should have. He had that posture of a man waiting for the situation to resolve itself. Shoulders slightly raised, weight on his heels, eyes moving from the door to the window and back. She sat on the bottom stair, her back to the upper floor, looking at the ground. She wasn't crying, wasn't panicking. She was thinking. I recognized that. I went to the side window of the living room carefully, positioned myself at an angle before looking. The street was empty from what I could see. The stretch between our house and the second one on the left, about 60 feet of wet asphalt and muddy shoulder. No movement. I went to the kitchen window and did the same thing, the same angled position, the same oblique approach before looking directly. Empty backyard, dark woods. Nothing in the strip between the retaining wall and the tree line. I went back to the living room. "We need to go now," I said, "while we don't know where it is." "It," Calloway repeated, as if the pronoun had weight. I didn't correct myself. I kept going. "Main road, no stopping, no splitting up. 12 minutes to the entrance if we walk fast. On the other side, there's a convenience store, lights, people, cell service. And if it's on the road," she said from the bottom stair. "Then we come back." She nodded. He stood still for 2 more seconds and then said, "Okay, let's go," in the tone of someone trying to convince himself along with everyone else. We went out the front door. I went first, looked both ways before letting them out. The street was empty in both directions as far as the sky's light reached, which wasn't far. The gray had turned a dark blue that in another 20 minutes would be black. The streetlights threw useless cones of shadow onto the wet asphalt, and the distance between them was wide enough that the dark stretches in between were longer than the lit ones. We walked along the right side of the street, away from the unfenced front yards of the unfinished houses. I was in front, she was in the middle, he was behind. My shoes weren't made for this. Low heel, smooth sole. And I had to watch the ground to keep from slipping on the mud streaks the rain had spread across the asphalt. There was no way to move quietly on that wet surface, and the sound of our footsteps covered anything that might have been moving between the houses on either side. We reached the intersection at the first cross street, about 100 feet from the door, a quarter of the way to the main road. I stopped to check the cross street before crossing. Looked left, looked right. The Werewolf was in the middle of the main road, directly ahead of us. On the stretch of asphalt we needed to cross to reach the exit. standing under the only working streetlight on that block, the yellow light falling from above and throwing an enormous shadow behind it. It was upright, facing our direction, with that stillness that wasn't the stillness of a frightened thing. It was the stillness of something that had no reason to move yet. I stopped. Both of them stopped behind me. 6'10", I calculated involuntarily. Because that's what I do with space. I assess height, volume, proportion. It was possibly more than that, but 6'10" was the number my brain produced. The shoulders were wide in a way that was out of proportion to the hips, the arms too long, the hands, if they were hands, hanging at the wrong height. The fur, wet from the rain, clung to the torso and showed the muscle underneath, dense and heavy. The head was tilted slightly downward, the muzzle pointed in our direction. It didn't come forward. It just stood there. "Turn back," I said quietly. "Slow. Don't run." Neither of them questioned it. We backed up along the same stretch we'd come from, facing it, until the distance was enough that I felt less exposed. Then I turned and we kept walking, and we didn't fully turn our backs until we were at least 50 yards away. Not because it was a strategy, because none of the three of us could manage it any sooner. We went back inside and I threw the deadbolt again. The living room was exactly as we'd left it. Lights on, the Callaway's folder on the kitchen counter, the garage motor boxes stacked in the corner. Everything identical, as if the inside of the house hadn't noticed what was happening outside. Callaway sat on the floor, back against the wall beneath the side window. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed over her chest, staring at nothing in front of her with the focus of someone trying to work out an equation in their head. "Was waiting for us," she said. Not exactly, I thought, but there was no way to explain the difference between an animal that waits and an animal that simply is. No intent, no plan, just present at a point in space that blocks the only way out that matters. It wasn't intelligence, it was wait. It was being there. "There's another way out," I said. "Through the South Cross Street, it runs behind the houses under construction and comes out at a different point on the main road. Longer, darker, but it's a different route." She looked at me. "You know this development." "I know the development," I said. "I've been here 3 times before today." "Then we try that way." "The workers come back first thing in the morning," Callaway said from the floor. "If we stay here until 6 a.m., it's 6 p.m., she said. "That's 12 hours. He didn't answer. I heard the sound before either of them did. A heavy weight stepping through the mud on the side yard, slow, unhurried. 4 steps, 5. Then it stopped. Then it started again, this time from the other side, the back. The werewolf was circling the house. I kept counting the footsteps outside until I couldn't separate them from the noise my own head was making. They were irregular, not in rhythm but in weight, sometimes lighter, as if it was moving fast across a firmer surface, sometimes heavy enough to hear the mud give way. They went from the right side to the back, from the back to the left side, from the left side to the front. There was no pattern I could map, and after a while I stopped trying. I stood in the hallway, back against the wall between the 2 living room windows, and waited. Callaway had gotten up off the floor and was standing near the kitchen counter, rearranging things in front of him for no apparent reason, moving the folder, setting his water bottle against the corner, crossing his arms, uncrossing them. She was still in the hallway, closer to the stairs than to me, and she'd taken off her jacket and was holding it folded against her chest like it was a useful object instead of a piece of clothing. The footsteps stopped on the right side of the house. They stayed stopped for maybe 2 minutes. Then the sound disappeared completely. None of the 3 of us said anything during the silence. The total quiet was worse than the footsteps, because at least the footsteps had a location. "When did you last hear it?" she said to me. "About 3 minutes ago. It might have left." It might have. She looked at me with the same expression I'd recognized the first time she looked at me that way. She wasn't asking whether I believed that. She was checking whether I was going to pretend I did. I didn't pretend. "We'll try the South Cross Street," I said. "We go out the back door, cross the yard to the fence on the side, turn left between the construction sites and follow a line parallel to the main road without actually using the main road. It's about 400 yards that way to the point where the 2 streets meet before the entrance." "In the dark," he said. "Yes, without knowing where it is, without knowing where it is. He took a slow, deep breath and let it out. She had already put her jacket back on. We went out the back door. I went first again, left them behind, crossed the yard diagonally toward the retaining wall on the right. The mud was deeper than in the front yard. The slope of the ground collected water there, and my shoes sank enough that I heard the sucking sound when I lifted my foot. The woods were 30 feet ahead of me, dark and dense and making no sound I could separate from the low wind that had picked up in the last 20 minutes. I reached the side wall. It was low, about 2.5 feet of unplastered concrete block, unfinished like everything out there. On the other side was the yard of the next house, also empty, also muddy, with the construction frame barely covered by a blue tarp that the wind had pulled loose from one corner. I climbed over the wall, helped her across. He came over on his own. The yard of the second house was larger and had no lighting at all. Not even the residual glow from the streetlights reached it. We walked close to the construction wall, using the frame as a reference point in the dark. The smell of raw concrete and wet wood was strong, and underneath it was that vegetal smell I'd noticed before. More intense now, closer to the woods. I found the gap between the second and third house, a stretch of about 20 feet with no structure at all, just open ground and more mud, and stopped before crossing. The werewolf was on the other side, not in the gap, a little beyond it, about 50 feet to the left, between the third house and the fourth. It was crouching, or in a lower posture than before, not on all fours but with its knees slightly bent, its torso leaning forward, its head turned in our direction. The eyes didn't glow. There was nothing cinematic about it. They were just large, dark eyes, catching what was left of the sky's light with that animal efficiency that makes you understand darkness isn't the same for everyone. I stepped back from the gap and pushed both of them back against the wall of the second house. Nobody spoke. I stood there processing what I'd seen. Not the werewolf itself. I already had the size, already had the shape, already understood enough. What I was processing was the position. The South Cross Street came out exactly through that stretch between the third and fourth house. It was there, not on the main road, not in the front yard. It was standing at exactly the alternate exit point I had calculated while still inside the house with the lights on. It wasn't intelligence, I knew it wasn't. But the result was the same. "It's in the way," she said very quietly. "It is." How did it know? I didn't answer because there was no answer that fit. An animal that has lived on that land long enough develops roots, develops points, develops a reading of the space that isn't reasoning but is just as complete. That entire development, every street, every gap, every strip of unstructured land, was its territory, not ours. It never had been. Calloway put his hand on my sleeve. "There's another way. Not one I know, but there might be. There might be." We went back the same way we'd come. Wall, backyard, back door, kitchen with the light on and the folder still on the counter. I closed the door and stood there with my hand on the knob for a moment, feeling the cold of the metal. She went to the small side window in the kitchen, the one that looked out onto the space between our house and the second one. She stood there for a while. Then she said, without turning toward me, "His tracks are all over the side yard." I went to her. The mud in the yard was marked. Wide, deep prints. The kind of weight that left that specific impression where the toes sank deeper than the heel. They went from the front to the back, from the back to the front, in at least 2 separate passes that crossed at points I couldn't fully work out. It had circled the house multiple times while we were inside, and it had reached the South Cross Street exit before we did. Calloway's water bottle had maybe 7 ounces left in the bottom. He set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it like it was a problem to solve. It was 6:40, maybe 6:45. My phone had no signal, but at least it still showed the time, and I had started checking it compulsively every few minutes without being able to stop. She had moved away from the window and was sitting on the kitchen floor back against the counter, legs stretched out toward me. There were no chairs in the house. The unit was delivered unfurnished, and the only place to sit was the stair step in the hallway, which had no sight line to any window. She had chosen the kitchen floor because from there she could see the back window and the side window at the same time without moving. I had noticed that when she sat down. I didn't say anything. "There has to be another way," Calloway said. It wasn't the first time he'd said some version of that since we'd come back. It was the third or fourth, and the tone was shifting with each repetition, becoming less reflective and more insistent, as if repeating it could produce a different answer. "We can't stay here until morning." "There's no way we're staying here until morning." "Why not?" she said from the floor. "Because it's the whole night, Diane." Diane. It was the first time I'd heard her name. "I know how long it is," she said. "I'm saying we can't just stand here waiting." "Someone will notice you didn't come back," he said, turning to me. "Someone will send someone to check." "Not necessarily tonight," I said. The showing wasn't on anyone's schedule but mine. He opened his mouth and closed it. Processed. "So, tomorrow morning when the workers get here." "It's 12 hours, Diane said, same as she'd said before, with the same flat precision. "I know how many hours it is." His voice had an irritation being held at the edge by visible effort. "What I'm saying is that sitting here waiting isn't the only option. We can run. 100 feet to the main road, it was standing still before. Maybe if we run fast enough." "You saw how big it is," I said. "I saw. Then you know fast enough doesn't exist." He didn't answer. He picked up the water bottle, drank what was left, put it back. I went to the side window and looked. The yard next to the house was empty, the tracks in the mud visible even in the darkness, because the wet mud caught the little light in the sky in a way dry ground doesn't. I counted the prints I could make out. They were from a heavy animal that hadn't been in any hurry at any point, that had moved through that space with the familiarity of something that knows every inch of what it's walking on. "Those tracks," Diane said behind me. She had gotten up without making a sound, and was looking through the same window one step to my right. "They go up to the window." I looked where she was pointing. She was right. There was a print deeper than the others right below the window ledge, and the mud around it was disturbed differently from the other marks, as if the weight had stayed in that spot longer than in the others. It had stopped below that window. When, I didn't know. It could have been while it was circling. Could have been while we were trying the cross street. Could have been before we'd noticed anything at all. But it had stopped there, close enough to press against the ledge if it wanted. And it had stayed long enough to sink into the mud. "We're on the second floor tonight," I said. The decision formed as I said it, not before. The upstairs windows are bigger and give a view of both sides of the street. "If it moves, we'll see it first. And if it tries to get in," he said. "The second floor windows are too high to access directly from the ground," I said. "It would have to go through the garage or the front door, and both of those have more solid construction than the sides." It wasn't a guarantee. I knew it wasn't, and from the way Diane looked at me, she knew it too. It was a probability assessment made with the information we had, which was not enough. But it was what there was. Calloway was the first to go upstairs, which surprised me slightly. I'd expected more resistance, one more attempt to argue for making a run for it. He went up without saying anything, his footsteps heavy on the new wood steps that hadn't fully settled yet and creaked in a higher pitch than old wood does. Diane followed. I turned off the lights on the ground floor before going up. Lights on downstairs and off upstairs would create a visible contrast from outside, and climbed in the dark, hand on the railing. The master bedroom had a window facing the street and a window facing the back. I went to the street-facing one first. The street was empty in the visible stretch. From our house to the first cross-street intersection, about 6 houses on each side. Darker than before because the sky had closed completely, and whatever natural light was left had disappeared. The unwired poles were useless columns spaced along the wet asphalt. Then the werewolf crossed the intersection. Left to right, through the lit stretch under the only working streetlight on that block. Long, even strides. No stopping, no looking toward the house. It crossed and disappeared between the houses on the right side in under 4 seconds. Fast, but not at the limit of what it was capable of. There was an economy to the movement that was different from running. It was displacement, going from one point to another because it needed to be at the other point. Diane was to my left. She'd seen it too. She didn't say anything. I went to the back window. The yard was empty, the woods dark, the oak tree line still in the wind that had died down. I stood there looking for 2 minutes without seeing anything. When I came back to the street window, it was standing at the intersection, facing the house. There was no way to know how long it had been there. Could have been seconds, could have been since I'd looked away. It was upright, still. With that stillness I already knew. Head tilted slightly. The streetlight fell on it from the side and showed the texture of the fur on its left shoulder, the width of the torso, the arms hanging with that specific weight. Calloway came up to my right and saw. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was the first real thing he'd said since we came back from the cross street. His voice was different. The plan to run had left it. Neither of us answered. The werewolf stood there for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness between the houses on the left side, out of reach of the streetlight, without any sound that carried up to where we were. The intersection was empty again, and the three of us stayed at the dark window looking at the space where it had been, as if it might come back, or as if looking served some purpose. It didn't, but none of us could stop. It was Calloway who proposed the third attempt, but it was Diane who put the plan together. It was almost 8 o'clock. We'd been in the master bedroom for over an hour, alternating between the two windows without seeing the werewolf move again after the intersection. That didn't mean it had left. I knew that. Diane knew it. And I think Calloway knew it too. But the time without a sighting had reopened a space in his head that needed to be filled with action. "This time we don't try the established routes," Diane said. She was standing in the center of the room, arms crossed, looking at the floor between herself and the window. Not the main road, not the cross street. We go through the middle of the development, between the foundations, across the open ground in the center of the block, without following any path an animal that lives here would recognize as a human route. "You don't know if it recognizes routes," Calloway said. "I don't," she said. "But both times we tried, it was in the way." "That's enough data." I looked at her. She was right in what she was saying, and the logic was cleaner than anything I'd been able to produce in the last few hours. Part of me noticed that, with a kind of involuntary professional attention, the ability to build an argument under pressure, the voice that didn't rise in pitch when there was reason for it to rise. Another time, another context, I would have thought she'd be good at the work I do. We went downstairs. The ground floor was dark the way we'd left it, and it took me a second to reorient after the lit windows of the bedroom. Through the kitchen side window, the tracks in the mud were still there, unchanged. No new ones I could separate from the old ones in that light. We went out the back door again, this time without following the side wall. Diane went first. I was in the middle, Calloway behind. We crossed the yard diagonally, in the opposite direction from the side wall we'd used before, heading toward the back where the house lots met a strip of unbuilt land. Not a yard, not a construction site, just uneven ground with low scrub that the development plan hadn't touched yet. The mud was different out there, firmer with dry grass underneath that held the weight without sinking as much. Our steps made less noise, which was good, but the uneven ground made walking slower than I wanted. Construction debris was scattered around. Scraps of lumber, a spool of electrical cable fallen on its side, mounds of sand under tarps the wind had partially shifted. Diane moved through all of it without hesitating, choosing her steps with a precision that came from watching the ground and ahead at the same time. I tried to do the same. Calloway caught his foot on one of the lumber ends and made a low sound, more surprise than pain, and we both turned to him before moving on. We reached the point where the back of the lots met the unbuilt central ground, a wide strip of about 100 feet separating the two rows of houses in the development, designated in the original plans as future green space, with nothing done to it yet. The middle of the block, dark, open, no structure to use as reference or cover. Diane stopped at the edge of that stretch and looked both ways before crossing. I did the same. That was when I smelled it. Not the wet earth, not the construction cement, not the crushed scrub underfoot. It was organic in a different way. Dense, warm despite the cold air, with an animal layer underneath that hit the back of the throat before I could identify what it was. It wasn't a smell from a distance. It was a smell from close. I stopped. "Wait," I said. Diane stopped. Calloway stopped behind me. There was nothing visible in the 100 feet of open ground ahead of us, but the smell was there, carried on the still air, and my head was running a calculation my body had already started. The calculation that a smell that strong didn't come from something 20 feet away. I looked to the left. The werewolf was about 25 feet away, at the edge of the strip of land, partially covered by the shadow of one of the construction tarps. It wasn't upright. Its torso was leaning forward, its weight distributed in a way that seemed transitional, like it had just stopped or was about to start. Its head was low, its muzzle pointed in our direction. 25 feet. The distance was different from anything we'd had until now. On the street, at the intersection, through the window, there had always been enough space for the head to process before the body reacted. Here, there wasn't. "Turn back," I said, and I was already moving before I finished the word. We didn't run. Every instinct was asking for it, but running on uneven ground in the dark meant falling, and falling there was over. We walked fast, very fast, the kind of walking that uses every muscle without giving up balance. Diane went ahead of me without my having to say anything. Calloway came behind with footsteps that were heavier and less precise through the debris. I heard the movement behind us. Not a run. Long strides, each one covering more ground than ours. The sound of mud giving way under a weight I already knew how to calculate. It wasn't gaining on us. It was keeping pace. We reached the back of the lots, then the yard of our house, then the back door that Calloway pushed open with his shoulder before he even reached the handle. We got inside. He closed it. The three of us stood in the dark kitchen, breathing. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps outside started again. Side yard, back, side yard. The same circuit as before, the same weight in the mud, the same absence of hurry. Calloway went to the counter and placed both open hands flat on it, head down. He stayed like that for a while. Diane was leaning against the hallway wall, facing the back window, arms crossed over her chest. "It was waiting out there," Calloway said to the counter. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say. It had been waiting, or it had arrived there ahead of us by chance. The result was the same. Every path that existed in that development had now been cut off, not by strategy, not by intelligence, but by the simple fact that the entire space was its territory, and we were three people trying to cross a place that had never been built for us to pass through. Diane turned to face me. "The woods," she said. I looked at her. "He comes from the woods," she said. "What if we go into them instead of trying to get out through the development?" I sat with that for a moment. The woods were dark, dense, with no path I knew. 100 feet from the backyard to the tree line, and then miles of forest in every direction with no reference point I could use. "No," I said. She didn't argue. She'd known the answer before she asked. It was the kind of idea you raise not because it's good, but because everything else had already been ruled out. Outside, the footsteps continued for a while longer. Then they stopped again, and the silence came back with that specific quality I had already learned not to trust. We stayed on the ground floor this time. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just what happened when none of the three of us started up the stairs. The upper floor had higher windows and a longer sight line, but it also had the feeling of being trapped at an elevated point with no quick way back down to ground level. And after 3 failed attempts to get out, ground level had become an instinctive priority that overrode any logic about observation. Diane stayed in the hallway. I went to the living room and sat on the floor beneath the side window, back against the wall, where I could hear both sides of the house without exposing myself. Calloway stayed in the kitchen, standing, and for a long time said nothing. It was almost 9 when he started again. "There's a point neither of you is considering," he said from the kitchen. His voice had that tension of an idea that had been dammed up too long. "It can't be in 2 places at once." I didn't say anything. Neither did Diane. "I'm serious. If we split up, 2 one way, 1 the other, it has to choose. And whoever it doesn't choose gets through." "Whoever it doesn't choose," Diane said from the hallway. "It's valid logic. It's logic that decides who dies. Someone might die anyway the way things are," he said. His voice had shifted, no longer an argument, more something being said because it needed to come out. Staying here waiting isn't safety. It's just postponing. I was listening to both of them while keeping my eye on the side window, on the strip of yard visible through the bottom of the glass. No movement. The mud had a thin white layer on top that hadn't been there before. The temperature had dropped enough to start firming up the surface. The old tracks were preserved in it with a clarity that in daylight would have been almost beautiful. "I'm going to try," he said. Diane came into the living room. "No, you're not," she said. "Diane, you heard her. You saw how big it is. I heard and I saw." His voice was controlled now with that specific calm of a decision already made. "And I also saw that all 3 times we tried, it showed up in the way but didn't attack right away. There's a window, maybe a small one, but it's there." I was about to say something, but Diane spoke first. "If you walk out that door, I'm not coming after you." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, no anger, no accusation, that made me understand that this wasn't the first time in their lives that some version of that sentence had been exchanged. Then he went to the kitchen. I heard the back door open. Diane didn't move. She stood in the middle of the living room facing the hallway that led to the kitchen, arms at her sides. I got up slowly, went to the hallway entrance, stopped there. The back door was open. Cold air was coming through the kitchen, carrying that smell of cold ground and night that I had already learned to associate with the space outside. There was no sound of footsteps. He had gone out slowly, or the firmer ground in the yard wasn't carrying the sound inside. I stood at the hallway entrance. Diane came to stand beside me. We stayed like that for maybe a minute and a half. The wind caught the back door and shifted it slightly, but didn't close it. Outside there were the usual nighttime sounds. Low wind, a branch moving somewhere, the background silence I had learned to read as the absence of footsteps. Then the sound came. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't anything I could call a human voice. It was an impact, heavy, brief, with a quality of real weight against real weight that didn't resemble anything else, and it lasted less than 2 seconds. Then a second, smaller sound, drier, that I couldn't name. Then nothing. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it that night. It wasn't the silence of not knowing where the werewolf was. It was the silence of knowing that something had happened in the space outside, and that something was not going to undo itself. Diane went to the back door and closed it, threw the deadbolt, came back to the hallway without looking at me, went to the stairs and sat on the bottom step, elbows on her knees, head slightly down. She didn't cry. She didn't say his name. I went to the kitchen side window and looked at the yard next door. The mud was undisturbed, no new tracks in the visible stretch. I went to the back window, positioned myself at an angle, looked through the corner. The backyard was too dark to make out the farther details, but the strip near the house was empty. I didn't go to the door, didn't open it. There was nothing outside that I could change by opening that door, and there are things that, once seen, don't go back to where they came from. I went back to the hallway. Diane was still on the step, in the same position. I sat on the floor near her, back against the wall across from the stairs. We stayed like that for a while without speaking. The silence between us was different from the silence outside. It had texture, it had weight, but it was livable in a way the outside one wasn't. "When it gets a little lighter," I said finally. "It doesn't have to be much, just enough to see the open stretch before the entrance." She raised her head. "We both go out the front together and we run. We don't stop for anything." She looked at me for a moment. The light from the half-bath sconce reached the hallway at an angle, faint but enough to see her expression. There was no hesitation in it. There was exhaustion, and there was something that stays after hesitation leaves, a hard clarity, belonging to someone who has already calculated what they're risking and decided to risk it anyway. "Okay," she said. Outside, after a long silence, the footsteps started again. Side yard, back, the same circuit, the same weight. As if nothing had changed. It was almost 10 when the footsteps stopped for good. It wasn't gradual. It was like the other times. One moment and then silence, no transition. I waited another 5 minutes before accepting that it had really stopped. Diane was on the bottom stair, in the same position as before. but her eyes were open and focused on a point in front of her that wasn't anything specific. The kind of focus that isn't looking outward, it's looking inward. I got up, went to the kitchen side window. The mud in the yard was firm now, the white layer from the low temperature covering the old tracks, with a uniformity that erased the details but preserved the shapes. I went to the back window. Empty yard, dark woods. No movement in the strip between the retaining wall and the oaks. I went to the living room window, the one facing the street. Looked from the side before looking straight on. The street was empty in the visible stretch. The street light at the intersection was still on. The only one, throwing that yellow light across the wet asphalt without illuminating anything useful. The unfinished houses on both sides were dark shapes with empty windows that reflected nothing. I went back to the hallway. It stopped, I said. Diane raised her head. For how long? I don't know. Last time it was almost 2 hours before it showed up at the intersection. She nodded slowly, processing. Then we don't go now. No. We need more time without sound before we try. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you know about this development?" I sat on the hallway floor back against the wall and thought about what I actually knew versus what was in the real estate documents. Construction started 8 months ago. Before that, it was dense woods, part of a private property that was subdivided after the owner died. Kellard Realty bought the entire lot and started dividing it up right after the estate closed. How many months of construction? 8, maybe 9, depending on exactly when they started clearing the land. She looked at me. He was here before that. Yes, and they just built on top of it. I didn't answer because there was no answer that fit, and because what she was saying wasn't a question. It was a statement. Someone had bought that land, done the survey, approved the plans, hired the construction company, opened streets and buried pipes and put up 28 houses in a space that already had an occupant. Nobody had checked. Or they had checked and found nothing that showed up in a technical report. "You were going to sell this house," she said. No accusation in her voice, just the fact. "Yes, to us, yes." She stared at the point in front of her for a while. Then, "It's okay. I'm not saying that to..." She stopped. Started again. "I'm just trying to understand the scale of what this is." I understood what she meant. The scale of what this is wasn't just that night, wasn't just the werewolf, wasn't just what had happened to Calloway in the backyard. It was the entire development. The other 27 houses, the 6 ongoing negotiations, the 3 units already sold with families who would be moving in sometime over the next few months. I didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the moment, and there was nothing to do with it in that kitchen on that night. "We need to know where it is before we go out," I said, returning to what was immediate and concrete. "We can't try the open stretch without visibility first. The master bedroom window is the best observation point we have. From there you can see the intersection, the main road, and part of the route we're going to use. How long do we observe?" "Until I'm sure enough." "Not totally sure. That doesn't exist, but sure enough." She got up from the step. "Then let's go up." We went upstairs in the dark. The master bedroom was the way we'd left it hours before. No furniture, nothing but the light hardwood floor and the large windows on both sides. I went to the one facing the street, positioned myself at an angle first, looked through the corner. The intersection was empty. The main road visible in the stretch before the intersection was also empty. The working street light lit the asphalt and a strip of the shoulders on both sides, and there was nothing in that strip that wasn't mud and gravel. Diane went to the back window. She stood looking for a minute. "Empty yard," she said. "Woods. Dark. Nothing moving that I can see." We stayed at our posts for the next 20 minutes. I swept the street window in strips, intersection, left stretch, right stretch, unfinished houses on both sides, any gap between structures that could hide enough volume. Diane did the same at the back, systematic, slow. Neither of us spoke while we looked. It was 20 to 11 when I saw it. It wasn't the werewolf. It was its shadow, the displacement of something large between the 5th and 6th house on the left side, about 500 feet from the intersection, fast enough that I almost wasn't sure of what I'd seen. I kept my eyes on that spot for 2 more minutes. Nothing. It's on the left side, I said, far from the intersection, but it's moving in that direction. Diane came to my window, stood looking. If it's coming from the left toward the intersection, she said. And we go out now through the front and turn right. We have the stretch between our house and the intersection before it gets there. How long is that stretch? About 300 feet to the intersection. Another 150 after the intersection to where the main road has real lighting. 450 feet total. Yes. She kept looking at the street. How much time do you think we have? I don't know. Depends on exactly where it is and whether it comes straight or along the side of the houses. So it's now or we wait longer. I looked at the spot where I'd seen the movement. Dark, still. I looked at the intersection. Empty. I looked at the stretch of road we needed to cross. 300 feet of wet asphalt and mud, clearly visible under the overcast sky that bounced the streetlight back in a diffuse glow. Now, I said. We went downstairs. On the ground floor, I turned off the half-bath sconce, the only light still on, and we stood in complete darkness for a second while my eyes adjusted. I went to the front door, put my hand on the knob, released the deadbolt slowly so it wouldn't make noise. Diane was right behind me. I heard her breathing, controlled, deeper than normal. You go first, I said quietly. I closed the door. I'm right behind you. Don't stop for any reason. Don't look to the left. Why? Because if you see it, you'll stop. And stopping is worse than not knowing. She was quiet for a second. Then, okay. I opened the door. The cold outside arrived before everything else. Not the cold you feel through a window or a door crack. The cold that wraps around you, that gets in through the collar and the sleeves and the leather of your shoes all at once. Like submersion. I came out behind Diane and pulled the front door shut carefully, keeping the latch from clicking against the frame. And for a second, I stood there with my hand still on the outside knob, as if I might need to go back in the next moment. Diane was already in the front yard, walking fast toward the shoulder, her feet picking through the firm ground carefully. I followed. The mud at the entrance was harder than the last time we'd gone out. The temperature had dropped another 2 or 3 degrees during the hours inside the house, and the surface gave less, which meant less noise but also less traction. We reached the shoulder. Diane turned right without stopping, heading toward the intersection, and I matched her pace. The street ahead of us was empty in the visible stretch, 300 feet of asphalt with the intersection streetlight at the far end, the yellow glow sitting still in the damp air. I didn't look to the left. I looked ahead and at the ground and kept moving. 20 feet, 30. The silence was different from inside the house. In there, the silence had walls, had a ceiling, had a geometry I could measure. Out here, it was open and went in every direction with nothing to hold it in place. Every step we took was exposed from all sides in a way the body felt before the mind named it. 40 feet, 50. Diane didn't look to the side. Neither did I. We heard our own footsteps on the wet asphalt, each other's breathing, the low wind passing between the empty houses with that sound of a long corridor. Nothing else. No weight in the mud, no displacement in the gaps between structures, no smell that wasn't cold air and wet earth. 60 feet. I was calculating. It was involuntary. It was what my head does with space regardless of what the rest of me wants. 300 feet to the intersection. 150 after that, 450 total. We were at the 60-foot mark, 270 left. Less than 2 minutes at that pace if we held the speed. 70 feet. Diane picked it up slightly. I matched her. The intersection was about 60 feet away. I could see the cross-street asphalt opening up on both sides, the unfinished sidewalk on the other side with the concrete blocks still ungrouted, the streetlight laying light over all of it with that quality of light that illuminates without revealing. 50 feet. That was when I heard it. Not from the left. From the right, the sound of weight in the mud in the yard of one of the houses on the right side of the street, about 100 feet past the intersection, in the exact direction we were heading. 2 steps. 3. Then it stopped. Diane stopped with me. We stood in the middle of the street, 30 feet from the intersection. I looked right. The werewolf was on the unfinished sidewalk, on the right side, past the intersection. Upright still, its torso turned slightly in our direction. The streetlight fell almost directly on it, and this time there was no distance, no glass, no filter between what was there and what my eyes were taking in. The wet fur pressed flat against the torso, the shoulders too wide, the arms too long, the head that wasn't the head of anything I could name with confidence. Its eyes catching the light from the pole without reflecting it, just absorbing, like wet surfaces that give back exactly what they receive. 50 yards from the development, the main road had real lighting. Wired poles, spaced 30 feet apart, enough illumination that a passing car could see us. 50 yards past the intersection. The Werewolf was 30 yards past the intersection, 60 feet in front of us. We needed 150. Diane was to my left. I heard her breathing change, not speed up, change quality, go shallower. I saw, in the corner of my eye, that she was looking at the same point I was. The Werewolf didn't move. I stood there running the calculation I didn't want to run. 60 feet to it, 150 feet to the light. The difference was 90 feet of open ground past the point where it stood. Nothing to use, no structure, no way around it. 90 feet where anything it did would be faster than anything I could do. Diane said my name, quietly, barely voiced. I turned to her. She was looking at me, not at the Werewolf. The expression on her face didn't have that hard calm of the last few hours anymore. There was something underneath it now. Something rawer that the calm had been holding back until it couldn't. But her eyes were focused. She was really looking at me. "Run," she said. "When I say." "Diane, when I say." I looked at her. I looked at the Werewolf. I looked at the stretch of road between it and the light. 150 feet of asphalt that on a normal day would take 25 seconds to walk. She waited 3 seconds. Then she said, "Now," and went left. Not forward, left. Into the yard of the unfinished house on the left side of the intersection, shouting with an intensity I wasn't prepared for, a sound that wasn't a word but had enough volume and urgency to turn the head of anything with ears. The Werewolf turned toward her. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I didn't. Feet on the asphalt. Arms, lungs taking in the cold air all at once. The 60 feet to where it had been passing on my right because it wasn't there anymore. It was in the left yard. It was going toward the sound Diane had made, and that had stopped. And that was now silence again. I didn't look left. I didn't look back. The wired streetlights appeared in my field of vision sooner than I expected. That different brightness the body recognizes before the eyes process it. The asphalt under my feet changed in tone, in texture, in sound. There was light above me. I stopped. I turned. Diane was on the asphalt about 60 feet behind me, at the edge between the lit area and the darkness of the development. She was standing, but with her weight on the wrong side. Her left arm held against her body in a way an arm doesn't sit when it's fine. Her jacket had a tear in the sleeve that hadn't been there before. Behind her, in the dark, no visible movement. She walked the 60 feet to where I was slowly, no longer running. When she got close enough, I saw the cut on her forearm through the tear in the jacket, shallow, long, the kind that doesn't kill you but bleeds steadily. She was pressing it with her right hand. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We stood on the lit sidewalk for a moment I couldn't measure. The main road was empty at that hour. No cars, no people. Nothing but the light and the wide asphalt and the cold that didn't let up. Then headlights appeared far down the road, coming in our direction. The headlights came slowly, the kind of speed of someone with no hurry on a road they know. Diane raised her right arm, the free one, and waved. I did the same, moved toward the center of the sidewalk, out of any doubt about what we were. 2 people standing on a lit sidewalk, visible, real, asking to be stopped. The car didn't stop. It passed about 20 feet from us, steady speed, no slowing down. I saw the driver's profile through the side window for less than a second. A man, indeterminate age, looking straight ahead. Maybe he hadn't seen us. Maybe he'd seen us and hadn't understood what he was looking at. Maybe he'd understood and kept going anyway. The headlights disappeared around the curve at the far end, and the street was empty again. Diane lowered her arm. She was still pressing her left forearm with her right hand, and the jacket beneath her hand was dark in a way the streetlights showed without me needing to get closer. "Keep pressure on it," I said. "Don't take your hand away." "I'm not taking it away." I looked both ways along the main road. To the left, in the direction the car had come from, there were more lit poles all the way to the curve, about 300 yards of visibility. To the right, the road went straight for longer than I could see, and at the far end there was a patch of light that was the convenience store I'd mentioned hours ago inside the model house. "There's a store," I said. "About a quarter-mile to the right. They have a phone, lights, people." She looked in the direction I pointed, nodded. We didn't leave immediately. I stood there a moment longer, and I only understood why when I caught myself doing it. I was looking back. At the development. The entrance to the development was about 50 yards behind where we stood, the access road opening between two concrete pillars that had no sign yet, just the posts that would eventually hold the name of the community when construction was finished. Kellard Meadows, if I remembered right. A catalog name, the kind that sounds good in printed materials and means nothing about the actual place. From where I stood, I could see the beginning of the development's internal street, the stretch of asphalt going in between the first two unfinished houses before curving left toward the model home. The dark poles, the mud, the silence of that space that in daylight felt like potential, and at night felt like what it was. There was no visible movement at the entrance, no upright shape between the pillars, no displacement in the shadows of the first houses, just the wet road going into the dark. Diane came to stand beside me and looked at the same point. We stayed like that for a few seconds without speaking. Then she turned and started walking toward the store. I went with her. The cold was more noticeable moving than standing still. It came in through the front of my jacket, which I'd unzipped when we went upstairs hours ago and hadn't closed since. I fixed the zipper while walking without stopping. My shoes had been soaked through since the second escape attempt, and every step made a wet, heavy sound I wouldn't have tolerated in daylight. The sole slipped slightly on the wet concrete of the sidewalk, and I adjusted my step before losing my footing, automatically, without thinking. Diane walked to my left at a steady pace, faster than I expected given the cut, but maybe the adrenaline was still covering what the cold and exhaustion would collect later. Her arms stayed folded against her body, right hand maintaining pressure. Every now and then she looked down as if checking, then looked forward again. We didn't talk during the quarter mile. The store appeared first as light, that white neon brightness that convenience stores have, and that from a distance looks more intense than it is, but that a tired eye receives as a signal of something that's working. Then the structure took shape, the canopy over the pumps, the glass storefront, two cars parked on the shoulder alongside it. The glass door opened when we were about 10 feet away. The indoor warmth arrived first, that heat of a closed, heated space that after hours in the cold feels excessive for a moment and then feels necessary. A man behind the counter looked at us when we came in, at me first, then at Diane, then at her arm. "You need help," he said. It wasn't a question. "A phone," I said. "And do you have anything for a bandage?" He was already coming out from behind the counter. He said there was a first aid kit in the bathroom, the phone was on the counter, he'd get both. Diane went with him toward the side hallway. I went to the counter. The phone was a landline, beige plastic, the kind that still exists at roadside gas stations. I picked up the handset and dialed 911 with fingers that hadn't fully warmed up yet, and that throbbed with cold at the tips. The operator picked up on the second ring. I said my name. I said where I was. I said I needed help at Kellard Meadows subdivision, and that there was an injured person with me. The operator asked the nature of the emergency. I held the handset for a second before answering. There was a version of what had happened that I could tell. The version with all the details, with the size and the shape and the tracks in the mud, and the sounds from the backyard, and the tear in Diane's jacket and Calloway, who was no longer with us. There was a version that was true, and that no one on the other end of that line was going to receive as true. There was a large animal in the area, I said. A woman is injured. Her husband isn't with us. The operator said she was sending a unit. She asked whether the animal was still an immediate threat. I looked through the store's glass front at the main road outside. The lit poles, the wet asphalt, the stretch of sidewalk we'd walked to get there. In the distance, a quarter mile back, The entrance to the development with its unmarked concrete pillars. No movement I could see. "I don't know," I said. The operator asked us to stay on site until the unit arrived. I put the handset back in the cradle and stood at the counter for a moment. The man from the store had come back with the first aid kit and was with Diane at one of the tables in the back, opening the kit, saying something quietly that she listened to with her head slightly tilted. The cut on her forearm was visible now without the jacket over it. Long but shallow the way I'd assessed it, already starting to clot at the edges. She was going to be fine. That I knew. What I didn't know, and wouldn't be able to stop knowing for a very long time, was what happened Monday morning when I got to the office. The Callaways had signed a pre-offer. There were 6 other negotiations in progress. There were 3 families with signed contracts waiting for a move-in date. There were 28 houses in a development that had been built on top of a territory that was never ours to sell. I went to the table where Diane was sitting and took the chair beside her. She looked at me when I sat down, just for a second, then looked back at the man from the store who was running gauze along the cut with the care of someone who didn't really know what they were doing but was trying. Outside, a patrol car turned onto the main road with its lights going but no siren. It stopped in front of the store. I didn't get up right away. I sat there a moment longer, with the warmth of the store around me, and the cold still leaving my clothes, looking through the glass at the patrol car's light hitting the storefront in alternating blue and red.